Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion this evening on voting and community engagement. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. That came from our forefathers. Now, as we look at this affirmation of we, the people, affirm that the government of the United States exists to serve its citizens. Or do we? Well, African Americans were set free by the 13th Amendment. Citizenship was guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. Black males were given the right to vote by the 15th Amendment. And thank God women were given the right to vote by the 19th Amendment. However, it didn't go as smoothly as we hoped. Therefore, the institution of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed the discriminatory voting practices. The act was extended in 1970, 1975, and 1982, abolishing all remaining deterrents to exercising the franchise and authorized federal supervision of voter registration where necessary. Today, we are at a place of mayhem in our society regarding voters' rights. It reminds me of a film I once saw with Dr. C.T. Vivian. Please show the clip.
If we're wrong, why don't you arrest us?
Why don't you get out in front of the camera and go on?
It's not a matter of being in front of the camera. It's a matter of facing your sheriff and facing your judge. We're willing to be beaten for democracy. And you misuse democracy in the streets. You beat people bloody in order that they will not have the privilege to vote. You beat me in the side and then hide your blood. I don't want you to leave. We have come to register to vote. Hey, everybody under arrest. Let's all go. You don't arrest me.
I'm here to tell you tonight that the businessmen, the mayor of this city, the police commissioner of this city, and everybody in the white power structure of this city must take a responsibility for everything that Jim Clark does in the community.
These issues with you today and more. We have some extraordinary panelists with us this evening that's going to share some very interesting perspectives with you. So get ready, because first on our virtual stage, we have Mr. Kevin Sinha, and Kevin is a community organizer fighting for equity and justice through and in civic engagement. He is the founder of Civic Georgia, a BIPOC-led grassroots advocacy organization that is uniquely powered by a collaborative of organizers. Since 2017, Civic Georgia has been actively creating space for community-led civic engagement, civic celebration, and voice for everyone in our state, with intentional inclusivity for our most silenced Georgians. In pursuit of this mission, Civic Georgia has collaborated with dozens of partners in registering tens of thousands of voters and empowering even more Georgians to be more informed, have active participation in our democracy. Kevin has led the way. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to our virtual stage, Mr. Kevin. Kevin, so glad to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh my goodness. And our next panelist is a rising second-year student at Stanford University and currently serves as a community manager at Future Coalition, helping to coordinate electoral coalition building plans across the country for 2022 midterm elections. Previously at Future Coalition, she developed voter education programs and on-the-ground youth voter mobilization strategies in the state of Georgia for the 2020 general election and runoff races. She started her organizing work in high school in 2018, advocating for equity in education as the president of the Harvard Debate Council Diversity Project. Welcome to our virtual stage, Miss Sophia Woodrow. Sophia, we're so glad to have you this evening.
So glad to be here. Thank you so much for everything you're doing.
Oh, our pleasure. And last, but certainly not least, Miss Ciarra Malone, who is a graduate of Kennesaw State University with a bachelor's degree in political science with a double minor in international affairs and African diaspora studies. While at KSU, Ciarra served as the political awareness and involvement chair for the Sigma Epsilon chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Under her leadership, the chapter was responsible for registering hundreds of fellow KSU students. Currently, Ciarra serves as the Georgia State Coordinator for the Fair Election Center's Campus Vote Project. Here she works directly with students, administrators, and partners organizations to normalize and institutionalize student voting by working directly with colleagues and universities across the state of Georgia. Ciarra has a passion for justice and using her background in minorities and politics to foster a more equitable community. Ciarra, welcome to our virtual stage. We're so glad to have you with us.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Oh my goodness, what a phenomenal panel we have with us. This is going to be truly extraordinary, and I am so pleased to be your moderator today. And what I would like to do, just to actually take you through a few of the elements of today's session, you all are the champions. You are the community civic leaders that are on the ground, and we want to get inside of your head, and we want to understand what is going on in our society as far as our elections are happening. What is really going on right now from an elections perspective? What's near and dear to your heart? What are you charged with at this very moment to push forward from an elections perspective? Kevin, why don't you get us started?
Sure. I'll start with municipal elections that are happening this fall. Cities, towns, counties around the state of Georgia are electing all forms of local leaders, and as many of us know, but many of us are still continuing to learn and get a better understanding of, a lot of the issues that we care about are actually most closely affected by those local leaders who is in those local positions of authority. So I'll pass it on to Sophia and Ciarra for their thoughts as well.
Specifically on the subject of youth engagement in those local elections, young people really the past few years have been delivering consistently for the state of Georgia. And I think just giving them the resources and the knowledge to empower them to get out in these local elections as well, in these city council races, these mayor races, school board races, and even empowering them to run for some of these positions. Young people, students can run and can vote, and just giving them the resources to be able to do that is really at the forefront of what Future Coalition is looking to do.
Very good, very good. Thank you, Sophia. Ciarra?
To both Kevin and Sophia's point, youth turnout has been the highest that it's ever been in the last 2 years. and we don't want that to end. And so I think one of the most important things, like Kevin mentioned, is the municipal elections. I know that a lot of people are talking about the municipal elections happening in Atlanta, but they're happening in counties across the state. I know that Clayton County is having a municipal election in September, and it's super easy for you to type in whatever address you have that you're registered to vote at and figure out where these elections, like what elections are happening and how you can vote in them. I know that just to like toss out a resource, Ballotpedia has a really cool sample ballot tool that they use, and you can type in the address that you registered to vote in, and it'll show you all of your upcoming elections. So whether those municipal elections are happening in September, November, whether they're happening in May of 2022, that a lot of people are going to be talking about, it's just really important that we emphasize that these elections are just as important as the general elections were, as the runoff elections were. Like everyone else has been talking about, a lot of these local leadership roles like school board, city council, mayoral elections, that's where you're going to see the most active change, and that's where we'll be able to have your elected politicians have the most direct contact with you and getting the change that you want to see. So that's definitely a focus right now.
Very good, Ciarra. That was great. I mean, your point regarding really voting down the ballot, having and voting in the local elections really does matter. See, Sophia, I know you've been on the battleground for quite some time now. What are some of the most significant changes have you actually seen from a local perspective by voting in the local elections? Some of those changes that you've thought, wow, if we had not gotten this individual in office, this change would not have taken place.
Yeah, I think a lot of young people are seeing that, specifically on the subject of some school board elections. Young people are really seeing that it's important that we have youth representation, that even we have student representation, because these are the people making the decisions that are going to be happening in our schools, whatever county you're in, whether you're in public school or another type of school. This is where your learning happens, and this is where a lot of the indoctrination happens of sometimes negative things, and sometimes when people aren't encouraged to vote, those things can all be traced to the school system. Education about racial and income inequality all goes back to the school system. So in these local elections, this is something that's very close to my heart, as I worked in educational equity for quite some time in high school. These local elections, these school board elections, who our representatives are, who's making the decisions about what we learn and what we teach our children, is really instrumental in how we create citizens that are going to participate in democracy and determine the course of it. And something that I've been able to see, both from the student perspective and from the perspective of someone who now goes to school outside of the state of Georgia, I've been able to reflect on it.
Wow, quite interesting. Thank you, Sophia. Kevin, tell us about some of the activities or programs that you have that's transpiring right now so that we can get individuals to the polls for these local elections coming up.
Sure. So I think one of the biggest things happening right now, Ciarra and I have actually been discussing this, is National Voter Registration Day is coming up next week, Tuesday, September 28th, and that is part of a now growing movement of civic holidays, which are designed to make sure that all of the civic participation that we're all working towards and supporting and empowering has as much opportunity to be celebrated as it is just done and achieved. So National Voter Registration Day is mainly about registering to vote, but in the state of Georgia in 2021, it's just as importantly about verifying your registration status, updating your registration status, making sure you have awareness of what elections may or may not be coming up. So both Ciarra and Sophia mentioned that there are municipal elections happening in counties around the state. And as you might expect, it's not universal. So not every city or every county is necessarily having an election or having the same election. So it's important to take some time and learn about what's going on in your community, especially if you're a student who's living on campus away from home. What steps do you need to take to update your registration status? Where do you prefer to be registered to vote? What does that mean for where you'll be able to participate in elections in the fall? And so right now, we're coordinating and supporting activities happening around the state by small community groups, student groups, organizations of all sizes who are trying to make sure that as many people as possible are registered and updated to be able to participate in elections this fall.
Well, that's powerful. Thank you for sharing all of that, Evan. You know, considering I know you, Sophia, of course, you have a affinity truly for our young voters, and definitely you, Ciarra. I want to ask, do you think your generations really believe in the essence of voting and that voting really matters? If you could just, you know, if you could, and I don't know if you know this, and the exact percentage, but you know, how many, you know, what percentage would you guess from your generation that really is adamant about voting, that you've surpassed that point where you've got to talk individuals into going to the polls? It's just a matter of when it opens, they're there. Let's talk about that. Let's have some dialogue around what our generation is thinking about voting.
I think it's important when discussing this topic to one, kind of make a distinction between the actual act of young people voting and whether or not young people care about the issues that they're voting on, right? Because I think that oftentimes there's this myth that young people are apathetic to the political process, when in fact, oftentimes is that politicians are apathetic to young people and simply don't take the time to talk to them about the issues that they're having in their communities and ways in which they feel they can solve them. And so I think that we've seen in the last year, the way that youth voting turnout has been the highest that it's ever been, not even just within like the last decade or anything like that. I think it's really important to see that young people do care about these issues and they do take the time to vote. But are we creating a space where young people have the access and the resources to be casting their ballot is a question that we have to be asking ourselves. So I think it's a lot less about the feelings around young people voting and whether or not we're providing them with a place to actually have a seat at the table and have their voices heard.
Very good. Seat at the table, having your voices heard. How about you, Sophia?
I completely agree with all of that. I mean, I see questions flooding in the chat about what the best way to stay up to date on voting and elections is while in college. That, I will tell you, to whoever asked that question, is something that I am grappling with currently as a student who goes to school across the country from the state that I'm registered to vote in. And as Ciarra was saying, a lot of young people, specifically the ones who don't vote, is usually because they can't. They lack the knowledge of registration deadlines. They go out of school out of state, so they're not sure how to mail in a ballot. They're not sure if the ballot is going to get there in time. Sometimes it doesn't get there in time. The process can be very confusing, and it's not something that is covered well in a lot of schools, specifically in the state of Georgia. At my high school, we didn't talk about voting really at all my senior year, and really bolstering resources to students in schools and in other community groups, I think could be really vital and increasing youth turnout even more than it already is, because we see it now in this state that we are in, of voter suppression laws increasing across the country. And what's important about voter suppression is that a lot of people don't necessarily consider that it also disproportionately impacts young people in addition to minorities. By making it harder to vote, you're making it harder for young people who are in classes, in jobs, who don't always have transportation of their own to access the ballot. And by providing these resources and these tools that Ciarra was talking about to getting young people out, could increase our numbers even more. Young people have been showing up and showing out. So just imagine if we fight these voter suppression laws and make a true democracy as we've imagined it in America. Imagine what young people could do with even more support and even more resources and an even more fair system.
Wow, excellent, excellent. Wow, great responses. I appreciate that. Kevin, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, what Sophia and Ciarra are highlighting here is that we all have an opportunity and a responsibility to empower young voters as never before. And I think that may be where the gap has been in the past, not young people caring about the issues or even young people caring to participate. It's the lack of empowerment. And empowerment can be used in a lot of different ways, and it means a lot of things to different people. And as far as I'm concerned, I think that means that if you are in a position, for whatever reason, to ensure that a young person has the best chance possible to vote, then you are responsible for doing so. And one of the ideas we had when we were, as a group, when we were catching up before the panel was, for those on this call who are attending, who may be faculty members at Georgia Tech or another university who may be in the administration, who may be a graduate student serving as a teaching assistant, who may have roles where they're guiding students as students. They may not see an immediate, obvious way, like what role do I have in this, but it is not out of the realm of possibility for y'all to commit to reminding students that the voter registration deadline is coming up, to remind students to update their voter registration status, to remind students that election day is coming up later in the year, to ensure that students are aware that election day is on such and such date, given whatever's happening locally. So Ciarra mentioned that there was actually an election in Clayton County yesterday. If you can be aware of those things and share that information, you are in a position of privilege and authority and, frankly, power where you can actually share that power with students. And that is something that we can all do. How can we actually take steps to empower young people to vote, not just sort of assume that, okay, well, for all intents and purposes, everybody knows that elections are going on, job done. We should actually take steps to make sure that people feel comfortable and feel ready to go. Maybe don't schedule an exam on election day, like be mindful of things like that, like make sure that students are set. These are really important things, not just for that election that's going on, but for students and young people to feel like civic engagement is something that they're being empowered and embraced and participating in.
Powerful, Kevin. Very, very good. We've got about 50% of our audience is faculty, so we know we're going to go out there and hit them hard. Faculty, you heard it straight from Kevin. He's giving you some excellent ways that you can actually promote the education of our students to go out and vote and what to do, because Sophia certainly shared her passion around the lack of education. It's not that the desire isn't there, it's just that many just don't know. So you can certainly help with that. Thank you, Kevin, for that. I so greatly appreciate it. Ciarra, I know that you've been on the campus of KSU and you've been working diligently on the campus to actually increase voter registration. What are some of the big issues that you've seen just to get our students registered to vote? What are some of the big hiccups you've experienced?
Well, I'll say, I've definitely done voter registration work on the campus of Kansas State, but I've also worked with a lot of students across campuses across the state of Georgia. And a lot of the big issues center around some of the questions that are actually being asked in the chat, right? So not every student who attends school in Georgia lives in Georgia or has an address in Georgia. And so there's a lot of confusion about that. Or even if you do live in Georgia, Georgia's a big state, and you may not be able to go home to go to your actual precinct to vote. And so there's a lot of confusion around absentee ballot voting, right? Or where you can be registered, whether you can be registered on your campus or register at home where you go back to when you're not on campus. There's a lot of questions around that oftentimes get overlooked or don't necessarily get the answers that they need. And so really focusing on individual students at individual institutions is really important so that they can figure out exactly how they need to cast their ballot ahead of time, right? Because in Georgia, we know how the U.S. mail has been working and how you can't necessarily wait 2 weeks before the election to figure out if you're going to vote absentee ballot, right? So I think oftentimes also making sure that students have a voting plan a month at least ahead of time is really crucial in ensuring that we'll be able to overcome the barriers that it may take to cast their ballots. I would say that's probably the number one problem that we see on campuses. Number two is often that depending on the elections, if they're not presidential elections, students simply don't know about them. And that's oftentimes because, one, these elected officials don't necessarily take the time to reach out to these students. So they don't necessarily know what these positions are doing and how they're benefiting them. So they don't often think to make the initiative to vote in these elections. Also, like it's been mentioned before, we have to hold a lot of administrators and professors accountable for the ways in which they include civic engagement work into their course material, right? Ensuring you don't put tests on days of elections, or ensuring that you're mindful about letting students miss class if they need a chance to wait in lines that have been astronomically long in the last 2 years, like people waiting for 5+ hours in lines to vote. And so there's a lot of different issues that don't enable students to be able to cast a ballot effectively. But I think, like I said before, making sure that you're talking to individual students and giving them the answers to the questions that they have about how they can cast a ballot, ensure that they take the extra step to actually go out and vote and then tell their friends about it.
So I know there's some really big issues around proper ID. And I know that there is, with those issues, even prior to what has taken place recently with the laws that have been passed regarding the tribal ID, right? I say tribal ID because the tribal ID, the state issued, that is your photo, right? Your tribal photo, and helping our students to understand the proper ID that they're able to present at the polls. What do you all share with them from that perspective? Because that has become a really, really big issue today.
Well, quickly, I'll also mention that as far as IDs are concerned, oftentimes students, if they go to a public university, can use their student ID. However, that's only for students that are going to public universities. So even if you go to a private institution like Agnes Scott College, for example, where there's an actual precinct on that campus, you can't use your Agnes Scott ID to vote. And so let's say you've changed your voter registration, you're coming from New York and you change it to Georgia and you don't have a Georgia ID, then you're going to have to get one in order to cast your ballot. So those are like important things as far as ID laws are concerned as well.
Good tip. Thank you, Ciarra. Sophia, anything from you?
Just to add on to that, also some student IDs, problem I found is they don't necessarily always have your signature on them, and that's something that can block them from being used. I know my Stanford ID doesn't have my signature on it, and I couldn't even use it as I'm registered to vote in the state of Georgia. Something that's been really interesting was, even though I'm a second year at Stanford, this is my first time on campus because last year everything was virtual. I actually arrived at campus last week and this is my second or third day of classes. But last year online, I got to see a lot of what was happening on the campuses around the state of Georgia, which was a really awesome opportunity actually, because Georgia's always gonna have the biggest piece of my heart. And something that is sort of adjacent to this issue of getting students out to vote is also just general civic engagement. So for example, last year ahead of the 2020 election, the city of Athens had a great shortage of poll workers, and they were looking to get some UGA students involved in going to the polls. And it's something that a lot of students don't, or young people don't necessarily know, that you can get paid for, you can register to do, and it's very simple to do. So I think encouraging students to not only vote, but also take that next step in the electoral process. Maybe go work at a poll, go encourage your friends to vote. Just try to get 3 friends, and then they can get 3 friends. Vote tripling, signing up for a phone bank or a text bank. So I think telling people that there are also these other opportunities that they can do that, if we give them access and the tools to, can be very easy. But when they don't have access or tools, it just seems like something that's very daunting, much like voting itself.
Wow, incredible. Thank you, Sophia. Great, great, great information. And Kevin, you have been in the trenches quite some time now. We always see you out. You're part of all of these incredible organizations. You're always putting your talent, skills, and abilities where it is so valuable to reach all of the segments of our youth as well as our adults. What are some of the complexities that you've seen from a voting perspective? Because you've worked a lot of the polls. You've been sent out when there are issues that have taken place at the polls. What are some of those biggest issues you've experienced? What are those heart-wrenching ones that you go, I cannot believe this is happening?
Sure. So yeah, y'all have all shared, this idea of there's kind of an overlap in Ciarra sharing about ID issues that students can face, and Sophia sharing about students and young people getting a chance to and learning about the opportunity to be poll workers. What happened last year, I'm pretty sure everyone in this group was directly and indirectly involved in recruiting young people to be poll workers because there was a massive shortage across the nation. We know that generally, but especially in Georgia, poll workers tend to be older. They tend to be in the senior age category. And during some of the elections last year, that was pre-vaccine, very high concerns around pandemic. And so older folks reasonably were not necessarily able to or felt comfortable working in the polls. And so young people took on that charge. And that, I think, is something that is definitely an opportunity moving forward, because we want folks who go to the polls to be able to see and interact with people who understand their experiences. So it's important to have young people working at the polls, because you are more likely, this is a universal concept, you're more likely to be understanding when that student comes and may not have the exact proper ID. And that isn't always something that can be addressed right there, speaking as a poll manager, but if you're open-minded, you can help figure out what to do and get to a positive result. And so for the voter, I would say, for the student, for the young person, for any voter, if you face something that is problematic at the polls, one, call the election protection hotline if you feel that that's necessary. I believe that number is just 866-OUR-VOTE. Two, whether you call or not, do your best to reasonably try to work through that, because it's not always a binary thing that, if you don't have the exact proper ID, then they have no option except to turn you away. There are options around provisional voting, there are options around following up and understanding if you have any other ID available, things like that. And I think that's sort of leaning into what Sophia was saying, that we do want young folks, whether you're a student or just college aged, to try out poll working. It is a really, really cool experience. It is very different than what you might expect. You get a chance to understand a lot of the procedures and processes that otherwise seem just like, legalese. And it also, as someone who is a voting rights advocate, it also helps you see the reality of what some of these things that just get passed into law can actually cause, where folks may have to go home and get another ID, or they may have to come back during election day, even though they tried to vote during early voting because they bumped up against some regulation or another. And I think understanding some of the challenges that people face and seeing them in action, for lack of a better way to put it, helps us be that much more informed and ready to advocate for removing a lot of the suppressive legislation and suppressive actions that are happening in Georgia. So hopefully people continue to try to look into poll working. I think all of our groups in some way recruit poll workers. So please check out all of our websites. I think we'll share them later on, but that's a really great opportunity. And Sophia confirmed it is a paid role, and it's also just a really unique service opportunity.
And Kevin, I can see the audience is just jumping out there, so excited about this information that you're sharing about poll workers, because about 50% of our audience said that they did not know how to get involved, and you've given them an excellent opportunity to become a poll worker. How would they then become that? What do they need to do? Where do they need to reach out to? How do they apply for a poll working job?
Sure. So briefly, it's all done through your county elections board. So you would typically go to the county elections board website, find their job listing for poll working, and then they'll guide you through some application and training and so on process. We always suggest do that as early as possible. Like if you wait till election season, it's possible that they're underwater in terms of processing applicants and getting training scheduled. And they may just have enough folks to work the polls, at least on paper. We know that may not be what you experience when you go to the polls, but do that as early as you can. And again, even on our website, if you're interested in actually like getting more of a guided hand through that process, then you can submit for more information.
Great information, Kevin. Thank you so much for sharing that. I do know that 180,000 were purged from our voter registration here in Georgia. 180,000 people. And we asked our audience today, have they actually taken the time to check out their voter registration status? And in that, we asked, what did you do it last week? 0% stated no, didn't check it last week. Did you check it the month before? 0%. 25% said, well, I'm not sure. And actually, 75% of our audience today stated that they are checking it now. That's a big deal, a huge deal. Kevin, I know you work closely with the People's Agenda. You get a lot of information from Helen Butler. Tell us about what is taking place from that perspective.
Sure. I'll be brief. Every so often, the Secretary of State's office takes it upon themselves to, I think, purge the voter rolls, and it's always under some sort of logistical aspect, like they're trying to keep the rolls up to date or something along those lines. The issue is that when you're talking about millions and millions of registered voters and eligible voters in the state of Georgia, and you do all of these things using systems, and you're not actually contacting people to understand what their status is, where their address is, you have a high risk of purging people who are otherwise eligible voters. There's also the sort of moral problem here that just because someone hasn't voted in X elections in the past Y years, that shouldn't be a reason to remove them from the rolls. There's no reason I can think of to be removed from the rolls if you are generally eligible to vote. And the fact that there are system-based processes that sort of do purge voters means that everyone is at some degree of risk of getting unintentionally purged. And that means that we should all regularly check our status. I'm firmly in the camp of doing this, not just because it keeps you and your registration status safe and it keeps you eligible to vote, but I moved back to Georgia in 2016 and registered to vote before the 2017 spring election, and somewhere in the process, the state of Georgia lost my voter registration form and did not. I mean, obviously, if that happens, you don't get informed. Like it's,
Right.
it's a thing that happens. And had I not followed up, had I not been working with the People's Agenda, with the League of Women Voters, I would have had no real recourse. And I think it was just sort of a wake-up call that it's not just an abstract thing, that things can go wrong. And the problem is it usually goes wrong for people who may not have the same degree of access to information, to resources, for people of color, for young people, for seniors. It tends to work out not in our favor when things go wrong.
Wow. Thank you, Kevin, for that. Sophia and Ciarra, you all have done a great deal of work with registering voters. And just to know that so many can actually get purged from the roll, what does that give you any additional indication of some acts that you need to take place? Anything that you need to do to make a change to this situation?
Well, to Kevin's point, I think when we think about college students, we have to think about how there's traditional and non-traditional college students who sometimes have not voted in the last few election cycles. And so ensuring, like Kevin's mentioned, to make sure they're checking their status so that they know that they're registered and don't get to the precinct on election day and are unable to cast their ballot is something that I think is super important. It's really unfortunate that so many people are constantly purged from the voting rolls. Like Kevin said, I can't think of a reason why you should be ineligible to vote simply because you haven't voted in the past few previous elections, as long as you're still meeting the registration requirements. But that's also something that we have to ensure that we are talking to our state legislators about, and having them ensure that the people in charge of doing things like this are being held accountable. So it's also an important point to mention.
Very good. Thank you, Ciarra. Sophia?
It's just always very upsetting to see this happen, and it happens so frequently, and it's cyclical. So we have to encourage people to check their registration status so that they can actually vote, so they can vote the people who are doing this out of office. They're elected officials. We're the ones who give them the power that they have, not the other way around. And somewhere along the line, it seems like this narrative has been flipped. But by encouraging people to check their status, get registered, and vote, we can change it to what it's supposed to be. And it's also just extremely empowering to check your registration status, even right before you're going to vote, so you know for sure 100% that you are registered. The first time I was voting, I was 18 years old. It was last year, and I went and they told me I wasn't registered to vote. I had to show them my voter registration card until they would let me vote. They insisted that I wasn't registered and then said I was at the wrong location to vote and I had to go to an alternative county. And just knowing that those are the things that happen to people. When it happened personally to me, it was, again, just another motivator, also very jarring. So knowing I am registered, this is the date I registered, this is my actual registration card, is something that I want to encourage everyone to do. Also, if you are in that situation, don't back down. If you know you are registered, you have a right to vote in this country. Don't let anyone tell you different.
Oh, I love it, Sophia. Look at you, trailblazer. You have walked a mile in that man and woman's shoes. Very good. Don't back down, audience. You know you very. She had a card, and I am not backing down. I am going to exercise my right to vote today. Wow, that's powerful, Sophia. Well, Kevin, Sophia, Ciarra, we have some questions from our audience this evening. And Alex, would you please share those questions with our panel?
Yes, Gwen. First up is, to what extent is voter suppression policies expected to dampen registration and voting versus inspiring people to participate?
Interesting question. I would say a lot of that is up to us, up to organizers, up to citizens. Organizers both putting programming and resources out there to combat these voter suppression laws, but also up to us as citizens to check in with each other and hold each other accountable. Make sure, oh, hey, Kevin, have you checked your registration status lately? Oh, Kevin, do you have a ride to the polls? Oh, Ciarra, do you want a carpool? Things like that. And protecting each other at the local level, at the personal level, is really a very effective strategy, and one that I encourage everyone to partake in, because it's not something that takes a whole lot of work. It's something that can be done very easily. And by making this work accessible to everyone, that's how we're going to fight voter suppression.
Great. Thank you, Sophia. Any comments, Kevin or Ciarra? Okay. Alice, what's our next question?
Our next question is asking if the panelists could share any ideas they have surrounding the engagement of high school students as a way to influence and encourage them to engage early in the process.
I like that one. If you don't mind, I'd love to take a suggestion. Something that we've done with our foundation, which has been phenomenal, that I'm hoping that was spread throughout the U.S., and that is we were able, as you all know, I'm the executive director of a youth leadership development program, and we work with a few high schools, and in those high schools we instituted the program. Once a child registered to vote had to be 17 and a half. Once you get 17 and a half, you can actually go and register, and for every registered voter that walked across the stage, we actually purchased them a voter registration cord that they wore, and it was so super great. It's in the program. You know, they are, you know, their identity has been identified as a registered voter. They were so super excited, so geeked about this. And I know that those students are the ones that are out to continuously voting today. So I would love to see something like that spread like wildfire throughout the U.S. And I think you were about to share something, Ciarra.
No, first of all, I think that's a really awesome idea. I think having cords, if you register to vote, is a really great way to incite high school students, especially to vote, because at least at my high school, having cords was like a really big deal. But I also just kind of wanted to go back to a point Sophia made earlier that had me really thinking about my own high school experience, and how she talked about how in high school they didn't talk about voting even like at her senior year. And I'll say I graduated high school in 2016, and like what was the midst of like one of the biggest presidential elections of our country, and nobody talked to me about like how to ensure I was registered to vote, or where my voting precinct was, or any of that information. And so I think that it's really important, one, to like kind of have that conversation started early about where you're, like, you can be 17 and a half in Georgia and registered to vote. So like, do you know where you're registered? Like, do you know where your precincts are? Who are you voting for? What do they do, and why are you voting for them? I think are conversations that we should start having in a more candid way than we do right now in high school, but also like making sure that we center voting in a way that doesn't seem like it's like a tedious task, but more of an accountability thing, and how voting for elected leaders affects high school students specifically, like talking about like what your school board does. Like, I know that a lot of high school students have done like protests and things like that and gone to school board meetings, but I think rarely do a lot of those students really know what those representatives are there for and the ways in which they're there to serve them. So having more candid conversations about how elected leaders are supposed to be working for them specifically, I think could really change the narrative about starting voting early.
Very good. Great job, Ciarra. Love it. Love it. Love it. Wow, that was great. That was great. Alex, do we have one other question from the audience?
Yep. One more question we have is, what are the biggest issues at stake in the upcoming local election? So more of a very much this cycle.
That's a great one. That's a great one. Who wants to jump in with local elections? Kevin, why don't you take us there? I see the wheels turning.
Sure. I mean, I'd love for Sophia and Ciarra to share from the perspective of students or former students, some of the issues that especially impact young people, especially like Georgia is chock full of college towns and college communities where campuses are, the social and cultural and economic engines of these towns. And so students being able to participate in elections and having good relationships with local elected officials is super critical. So I think their guidance here is probably more important than what I'd share. So I'll turn it over to them.
Very good. Sophia?
So the first and uniting issue I always think about when I think about local elections, specifically in Georgia and specifically in the city of Atlanta, that crosses all partisan divides, is the traffic. Think about our infrastructure, think about our roads, think about how terrible Atlanta traffic is, and now think about the fact that you have the power by voting in local elections to vote for the people who are making the decisions about our infrastructure, about our roads, about where our money is going to be spent. Imagine not having to sit in 45 minutes of 285 traffic. Imagine a world.
I'm looking for my reaction buttons here, Sophia, because I'm going thumbs up, heart. You're absolutely right. Oh, you are absolutely right. It is horrendous. Wow. Great thought. Ciarra, how about you?
I definitely second Sophia's infrastructure complaints. Like, think about potholes and all the issues that like make Atlanta, but things that like we hate that could very easily be fixed if we were talking to our elected leaders about it and holding them accountable and making sure we're voting in elected leaders that care enough afterwards to actually get the job done. I think other issues that are like very state specific that we've been talking about are like racial equity and justice issues, the pandemic responses. We've had college campuses across the state protesting about what they are and are not allowed to do as far as the pandemic is concerned, as far as like forcing students to wear masks on campus and things like that. Like, those are all things that our local elected leaders are making decisions on. And so it's important that that's the things that we vote on to change in the next coming year.
Very good. Getting those locally elected officials to understand the power of our youth, to understand the power that you have, and the numbers. We've got substantial numbers of voters on our college campuses. And it is certainly a waste if you're not spending time as an elected official in those forums to hear from these bright young minds. That's absolutely imperative. We did ask the poll, and we asked, how do you feel the national spotlight on Georgia's election earlier this year has affected your personal level of civic engagement going into the fall? 90% of our studio audience stated, I feel more civically engaged. 0% stated, I feel less civically engaged. And 10% had no change. But 90% feels more engaged. We've had an opportunity to talk a great deal this evening regarding voting, but there are so many other areas that we have to be concerned about from a civic engagement perspective that we need to ensure that we all are caring for the people, because we are the people. So what are some additional ways, what are some other things or other arenas that you all are working in to build up, uplift, and engage so many others in the great work to care for the people?
I personally think we'd be remiss with having this conversation and not at all talking about redistricting work that's going on. That's a really big deal in Georgia right now, and often something that students don't get a lot of education around. Redistricting only happens every 10 years. The last time it happened for me, I was 12, and so I wasn't necessarily paying attention to it. And so when it came up this year, all of a sudden I know what redistricting was, but I didn't have any idea of like what that process looked like. And so I caught myself this moment being like, oh my gosh, like I don't know how this works. Like I don't know how it's affecting me. I haven't had to pay attention to it for a really long time. And so redistricting is something that we're focusing on a lot of college campuses, especially because if you look at maps, a lot of these college campuses are gerrymandered in ways that's so inefficient for these students to be able to cast their ballots. And just as an example, like there's schools like Clark Atlanta who have precincts on their campus, but half of their campus can't vote on them because of the way the campus itself is split into multiple districts. And so paying attention to issues like that are going on right now will be really essential. And not only like voting work that happens going into the elections, but just civic engagement wise, as far as ensuring that like fair maps are drawn.
Very good. Thank you, Ciarra. Thumbs up. How about you, Sophia? Tell us about what else is going on.
A project very close to my heart that isn't directly related to voting is one that Future Coalition is currently doing at historic Pratt Pullman Yard. So for those of you at Georgia Tech, a very quick drive away, at Pratt Pullman Yard, we've started a mural series where we will be uplifting young local Atlanta Black artists and allowing them to paint civic engagement, cultural and historic murals along this grand wall at the very front of the yard. Our first mural was just recently done, and it was a mural of A. Philip Randolph, and we're hoping to fulfill the rest of the walls and even some of the old train cars with some other murals of local Atlanta heroes and civil rights activists. And it's just something that I think is amazing. I love uplifting young artists and honoring the history of the city. So as the murals start to get done, take a drive down to Pratt Pullman. I think it's really going to be a very special project.
Wow, that's incredible, Sophia. Love that. I must visit. I love the arts. I love the arts. And how about you, Kevin?
Sure. I think along the same lines, for anybody who's joining us today, look into the civic holidays. National Voter Registration Day is one of them, but there are a few more coming up throughout the year, and they're now annual events. Many of them started last year. National Voter Registration Day has actually been around for about a decade, but these are really good ways to find opportunities to get involved, as well as to just sort of normalize civic participation. It can be heavy for all of us to just have, ebbs and flows, and when a presidential election comes around, you hear nothing but about the election. And then when it's done, things sort of quiet down. And so it can be, it's almost like having to run a marathon every few years, but if instead it was just a healthy jog, once a week or what have you, then I think that we have a better chance of young people, especially the generations that are coming up now, feeling like civic engagement can be a part of a lifestyle as opposed to a chore or a task or something that, either my candidate won or they didn't. If it can become more of a, hey, how can I think about being involved in and supporting my community? That is great. And the civic holidays that all of us on this call here are working on and uplifting are really a celebratory way to do that. And I think that means that there's more positivity to something that will help get more folks involved.